So this was probably one of the most difficult cases we've faced.
One, recently.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
So the client was found not guilty of sexual assault, sexual exploitation. We're not going to comment much on the merits of one side or another, but it was a difficult case. So just to frame it, and we're doing this for people who had questions, and I think we're mindful of some of our viewers and that they might find this interesting. So it was a difficult case because it involved the stepfather with his stepdaughter, who had a very good relationship for a prolonged period of time, and there was these massages that were for a therapeutic purpose at the beginning, and then allegedly during this last year, when they were together in the house, just before she was going to take this big trip to go somewhere, I'm not going to say where, there was a lot of tension in the house over things, and ultimately she made a complaint to the police. But she had a diary where she was allegedly chronicling the sexual assaults. Mm-hmm. And then as we found out in the case, he had read the diary when they were away on a short trip, got extremely angry about it, confronted her about it, and he actually threw out the diary.
Yeah, it makes it kind of unique because there are cases with diaries where, if it's in possession of the accused, then, you have to bring forth applications to try and, admit the evidence. If it's in possession of the complainant, it's just open season to try and corroborate the allegations. But this was a unique case in which the diary actually ceased to exist because it was destroyed. And then the question was whether the destruction of the diary was an attempt to hide evidence.
Right. So the Crown was relying, this was one important aspect, so consciousness of guilt or after the fact conduct, that he destroyed it in order to get rid of inculpatory evidence. Two, we were not counsel for him when he was originally arrested. And he went into the police station, in spite of the advice he received, gave a full statement with a number of problematic comments during the statement. We're not going to go into them, but let's just say it was not the most exculpatory statement we could imagine. It was a challenging statement.
But some of it was leading evidence from, the police making statements and kind of putting words in his mouth and such like that. So that became an issue at the trial as well.
And overall, there was certainly some evidence of him being faced with an allegation close in time to when she went to the police and how he responded to that, which was tied up slightly in relation to the diary, but why not speak to your wife about what had happened at the time? You never told her. So there was an issue of what we face sometimes is when you're confronted with an allegation and your lack of real response to it, or what the perception would be of how somebody should respond to that.
Well, and as you say it that way, it is a problem when you think that people should respond in a specific way, because people can respond in ways that are counterintuitive sometimes. Just respond in emotional ways that, and you can't really put a template on that issue to say an innocent person would have responded in this specific way, would have done this thing. A guilty person would absolutely do this thing. People just respond emotionally to things, and it doesn't always make sense.
And everybody has a different psychological makeup, so the way they respond to it may be consistent with the way they handle stress. And so sometimes it's avoidance. So the other thing that I wanted to say was the Crown's case was anchored on a number of significant pieces of evidence, and the other thing was that the complainant at the time was a youth, so her statement went in under Section 715.1 of the Criminal Code, which allows for anybody who's under the age of 18 who gives a statement and meets certain criteria, the statement can be admitted for the truth of its contents at trial, and this is what happened here.
As long as the complainant adopts the statement after it's played.
Yeah, which I've never seen that not happen.
Yeah.
But so anyway, so that went in. So there's a few reasons why I'm just raising this. So it was a particularly challenging case, but I think it's important to be mindful of a few things, and that's why I wanted to talk about it. One, when you have evidence that's not necessarily favorable to you and it's admissible, like the statement that he provided to the police and to his actions regarding the diary, you have to lean into that evidence. In other words, you don't ignore it or try and play it down or hope to God it somehow disappears during the course of the trial. You got to really lean into that evidence. And it's vital that you deal with it head on and make it part of your defense narrative, part of your cross-examination. It's got to fit, and it's got to It's got to go with your flow and narrative of the case.
So, it's a storytelling element in which you have to actually bring, the judge, the trier of fact, if it's a jury, you have to bring them into your storyline and explain to them why you took the actions you did, as opposed to leaving it up to them to decide what a person really would have done in certain circumstances. So as opposed to just telling, you have to show. You have to actually bring to life the accused's state of mind, and have them be able to testify and show people why they were responding and taking the actions they did.
Yeah, so for example, with this statement, very important that you review it multiple times, because after reviewing it multiple times, you will finally start to chart it out and parse it down as to what really was going on. And you can see, as Diana had said, the police officer was using some leading questions and introducing language that then the accused picked up on. So the tactic of the police officer was to introduce a phrase, then have the accused adopt it during the interview, and therefore try and use that as some form of almost an admission to show nobody would say what he said unless they were guilty of doing something wrong, even though this was introduced by the officer.
A little more clear, it was inappropriate language that you would expect a parental figure to use towards...
Not to use.
Inappropriate. You wouldn't expect them to use that kind of language, and this is language brought in by the police officer.
Right, so point is, carefully read the statement multiple times, and you will see in there sometimes, especially not all the time, but there will be facets of it that you can pick up on. And then as you're saying, when you discuss the statement with the client and go through what their state of mind is and how they're responding to it, you can then work out how he's going to respond to that statement, either in chief, in explaining certain things, or in cross-examination as to how he's going to explain certain things. And you've got to be careful about if there are deficits, if there are certain omissions that he makes in the statement, he's going to have to deal with those head on, either in chief or in cross, preferably in chief, to blunt cross-examination on it. But there are ways to deal with the statement, even if voluntary and admissible, so there's no charter violations. So that was one which is we had to pay very careful attention to this unfortunate statement that he provided, and it worked out. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about consciousness of guilt for a moment. So after the fact conduct evidence is circumstantial evidence of post-offense behavior that is offered to support relevant inferences consistent with the accused's guilt. The theory being that such behavior is consistent with the conduct of a guilty person and inconsistent with the conduct of an innocent person. And this is, you can find this in the Millard case, 2023 ONCA 426, but there's lots of case law on this. And if you can provide a reasonable alternative explanation as to why the individual would have acted in the way they did, or did the things that they did, or said the things that they did, that's being used as after the fact conduct, you can then preempt the court from using it as an admission in some sense, or as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Mm-hmm. So in this case, he had a really good explanation.
Yeah, I mean, there was a certain amount of rage involved in his reaction to...
We can talk a little bit about it. So he read in the diary certain things that of course, we didn't have the diary, so his version of what he read would be different from what the complainant said. But then the complainant couldn't really remember what she allegedly wrote in that diary and was completely inconsistent as to how long she'd been journaling in the diary.
Well, I was going to say that the question of how long the diary was kept for became a specific issue. So
it was interesting. So there was generally some acceptance of what the accused stated about what he read, but his reaction to it was what really helped in this case. So if you want to elaborate on that.
This episode is sponsored by EasyDNS. EasyDNS is a domain name, registrar, and host that has a 30-year track record in the domain and web hosting industry. Whether it be cancel culture, platform attacks, or nefarious actors online, move your domain and web hosting over to EasyDNS, one of the most secure web hosting services, and help support Not on Record in the process. All you have to do is go to easydns.com/notonrecord, or when you sign up at EasyDNS, use the promo code NOTONRECORD at checkout. Thank you, EasyDNS, for your support of Not on Record, and now back to our podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, so, this was a diary being kept by a young girl who was in a difficult state of mind and was struggling with a lot of issues, and there were some issues to do with drug usage and feeling like she was losing track of reality. And so the entries that our client had read did not match at all what he was accused of, according to him.
According to him.
According to him. But of course, as you said, the diary didn't exist anymore. And he actually said to the police, I wish I'd not thrown the diary away, because it would have shown you that what she was accusing me of in the diary was completely different and in fact impossible. Given the description of events and the structure of the bedroom and, the bed and style and everything. So he was like, I wish I actually had it, because it would have actually helped me if I'd not thrown it away. So that was a useful thing as well, if he's believed. But this is just simply his testimony, because we didn't have the diary.
Right, but what was also important was that his reaction to what he allegedly read resulted in him confronting the complainant and having an argument with the complainant and admitting to the complainant not only that he read it, and that he threw it out in a fit of rage because he was so enraged as to what was written in there. And to that extent, he also communicated this to the police in a statement. So it's not something he made up at the time of trial. So by the time trial rolls around and he talks about it, you could see in him the buildup of his anger and internal turmoil about reading what he said he read, which gave an authenticity to his reaction. In other words, he reacted in a way, throwing it in a fit of rage because it was so absurd, it was so false to him and so hurtful that that's what he reacted to. That was a plausible explanation for why he did what he did.
Now, that said, demeanor is
Let's not go into demeanor just
a
yet.
factor, but we'll get to that
Yeah.
in a bit.
But he gave an explanation, which was to some extent buttressed by the fact that there was an in fact nature to what he was saying. But leaving aside the demeanor, assessing whether this evidence can be used as after-the-fact conduct is a highly contextual and fact-specific analysis. The existence of two or more plausible explanations for evidence of after-the-fact conduct does not make that conduct equally consistent with those explanations, such as a proposed inference, that may lose its probative value. In other words, there can be two or more possibilities where, in fact, it is not necessarily consciousness of guilt and may, in fact, lead to a plausible inference that the accused had done this as a result of some other reason. That's what happened in this case. And it was very arguable that his reaction was because he was so taken back, so upset, so hurt by what he read that his just anger got a hold of him and he threw it out. And therefore, the court did not find that his conduct resulted in any type of consciousness of guilt evidence or after-the-fact conduct. If you want to talk about demeanor, talk about it a brief bit here.
Right. So, demeanor quite often is discussed in terms of a complainant being emotional and distraught in describing the events that they say, happened to them. But in this case, the demeanor of the accused played an important role in that he was very consistent with his sense of indignancy and rage of having been accused of this. It went a little bit over the top at one point, at which point he then apologized for losing his temper. And, there's an interesting...
Not once, but several times. Yeah.
There's an interesting reason, actually, why he was so angry. Do you want to say... Okay.
No, let's not, but...
Okay. But there were some circumstances in the courtroom that caused him to aggravate him. And, but it wasn't like a big explosion and stuff. And so his demeanor was compelling. At the same time, there's a, sort of a oversight or like rule about demeanor that you can't, it can't determine the case for you. It's a factor, but it's not the main factor. You have to be careful about demeanor.
Demeanor evidence is in no way a dispositive, determinative type of piece of evidence. It's just but one factor a court can take consideration of. And the court will be very cautious, and in this case, the judge was extremely cautious as to explaining just how it played into her ruling. But she did pay very careful attention both to the complainant and to our client, so much so that she noticed that his consistent repulsion and anger at the accusation appeared also at times in examination chief and cross-examination, and his demeanor and bodily movements were consistent throughout examination chief and cross, where he'd lean forward, he'd point, he sometimes banged the table, he'd get red in the face. And it was all consistent at the revulsion that he explained he had and anger at being accused of this. And sometimes people, when they have their character, their honor, their integrity challenged like this, are not able to respond in other ways other than anger, and they just do. And in this case, it did play a factor, a small factor, but a factor. But it was interesting.
That's important to know, though. It's only a small factor, because
It's only a small factor.
You can't just go in and say, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth. Like it doesn't work like the movies.
But it had an interesting consistency with how he reacted to the diary. So I want to talk, for another moment about being careful as defense counsel about the timing of complaint. So the doctrine of recent complaint is something you can't get into, where it's like they wait 6 months, they wait a year, whatever. But the circumstances surrounding...
Sorry, just meaning that you can't say that they're less credible because they didn't report immediately.
Right. So, but the circumstances surrounding the timing can be important, especially if it's tied in the motive to fabricate. And that's something that is extremely useful, especially if you have, and in this case, we had a multifaceted, layered type of approach to fabrication. And it had legs, and it was tied into two very distinct arguments, relatively close in time, as well as an ultimatum of our client that basically put her social life under attack, including, her life at that time with her boyfriend.
And that's the really important thing, is like you take a teenage girl and say, you can't see your boyfriend anymore. Otherwise, you're going to
do this, and you're going to do this.
We're going to send you out of town.
Or I'm pulling all support for you. So this is a stepfather who's taking care of this person since age 2. So in this case, he was very adamant to say, if you do not stop seeing this person, who he was blaming for a lot of stuff, then I'm going to withhold support and all these things. And so that
out of the house.
So that, he kind of apologized about that to her, but it in cross-examination, which was extremely important in this case, the complainant had admitted that our client was somebody who was to be taken seriously, that he had high expectations of her, that when he was angry, and he meant what he said, and he was going to follow through on what he said, and she understood that. And so the threat to her social life was really something that was quite serious and very timely to when she made the disclosure and then ultimately went to the police. And the complainant failed to talk about in her statement. So we carefully analyzed the 715 statement, because now it's a statement in evidence that you can take as a source of inconsistency to in-court testimony. So there is rich value in that. And she had never disclosed to anybody. What we got out in cross-examination was that there was a tension for the year leading up to this allegation, where there was a lot of conflict with my client and mother about certain behaviors, use of marijuana, connection with the boyfriend, and other things.
And she tried to deny it at one point, and
flatly denied it. It was persistent cross-examination, coming at it in different ways, and then eventually made these admissions, which then factored in, very importantly, not just into her reliability and credibility, but giving support for the motive to fabricate. And again, it was multifaceted, but again, there was this argument that we were making that her social life was under attack. She was supposed to go away somewhere for a year to take a gap year before university. They would have removed her from these allegedly bad influences that we were saying, that she admitted to.
Would have removed her from her boyfriend.
Right. And ultimately, she never went.
Right.
She laid the charges, like she went to the police, the charges were laid, but she could have still gone on this trip and never did. So just my advice, in case there's lawyers like me watching this, and you probably know this, or if you don't, I'm sure you do. But anyways, just when you carefully look at the circumstances of the disclosure in relation to whether there's an argument, it can factor a lot into a motive to fabricate and really, really be considerably helpful. And it was in this case, because we were firmly of the belief of what our client was telling us about that tension was absolutely true. It was supported by the mother to some extent about an argument they had. And so we had a really good basis on this. And ultimately, it was accepted by the court because it was true. There's one other thing I want to talk about. So what I'm flipping through right now are written submissions. So
important.
Yeah, in 99% of our cases, we will draft at the end of a case. If we don't have a lot of time, we'll leave court, let's say around 4 o'clock, get to our office and work till 1 o'clock in the morning to bang out written submissions. And this wasn't small. It's 14 point, because I'm getting where I need to have larger font. But it was 33 pages. And it was very important to detail and set out in a very and a proper argument, organized and bringing home certain points of evidence and the law to the judge. And we do this in 99% of our cases, unless we're in front of Justice Malloy in the Superior Court, who we love, and she's like, she just cuts right to the chase. There's no need to think about it.
More than Marcy.
Yeah, let's just go do this. But, you know, in this case, like many others that we do, I highly recommend to other counsel that are watching, if you can, written submissions, even if it's point form, is extremely valuable, because a judge will then lift out of your submissions points that they accept, especially if you're fair in your representation of the facts, fair on the evidence, and fair on the law.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's a hard copy version of what you would be saying with no mistakes about what you're saying, because it's written. So you don't have to just rely on them understanding your submissions. They can literally look at it, reread it, and, you know, and like you said, quite often lift out sections of it. To summarize what our position is. Yeah. And, you know, it's practically invaluable.
I think it is invaluable. And, you know, especially when you come to the law. And, you know, we love to start off with a couple of paragraphs in NISNIC. And it's important for judges to say that. So they read those in. And there's that one paragraph from Justice Quigley's decision that we like, paragraph 111.
I know.
Which basically predated the Kruk decision. He was ahead of his time.
Yeah.
Because he was relying on common sense. Grounded in how a complainant stated that they behaved and what they were going to do and what their personality characteristics were. And he said it's fair when you have grounded assumptions, grounded in the evidence.
It's not a stereotype. It's based on the evidence given by the witnesses during the trial.
And sure enough, Kruk, which came out years later by Supreme Court of Canada, basically adopts that approach, even though that wasn't the case on appeal. So in this case, we had the judge quote from
that
paragraph.
Approach being you can use common sense.
Yeah. So we had his Honor's particular quote was relied upon. So it really valuable if you can, even if you're doing it in point form, to get down your framework of analysis and get down your points and get down the law, because the written submissions really helped. And in this case, it was completely invaluable because it was a difficult case. With the statement to police, with the diary issue, with being faced with an allegation and the way he's alleged to have reacted to it, this was a very challenging case. And we're not commenting on, you know, false allegations or anything of this. We're talking about the methodology of going through and analyzing and dealing with, you know, evidence that can be quite challenging, leaning into it, hitting it head on, analyzing it carefully, and then just the incredible value of written submissions. Yeah. So
great success, because this would have been a case if there was conviction, it would have been an unsafe one. And
on the evidence, it would have. And I think it's one of those cases where the judge, you know, wasn't able to decide what the truth was here. It was a difficult case, but everybody had something at stake. And we think it would have been an unsafe conviction, but it was an extremely well-reasoned case. It was very well argued by the Crown, but fortunately, the client had success. But importantly, these are areas that we just wanted to communicate to whoever, because we get these questions and people want to know more about why and how we do certain things. So I just thought these elements were important to talk about since it was fresh in our mind.
Yeah.
So well done. Good work.
Yeah. It was a great outcome. And, you know, for a good person.
A very delightful client, like just delightful in the family. So Pillow Talk. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment. We get lots of comments and emails, and we like to fashion some of our podcasts off the questions we get. So
we absolutely
keep doing that.
And we're going to have some podcasts coming up that are direct responses to people's questions for us to talk about things. So we do read them and we do care, and we're happy that you're watching us. So keep doing that.
So thank you very much. And again, I just want to say thank you to our sponsor, EasyDNS. You'll see our commercial about it. Thank you very much and good night.